in the book of Mark, and we are going to be in Mark chapter 6 tonight. If you have your Bibles, I hope you do. Tonight I want us to talk about the things you see and the things you don't see, and at times when you see too much. Now, chapter 6 is a long chapter, so we're not going to go verse by verse. We're just going to take a few verses at a time. I think there's over 50 verses in chapter 6. So let's just start with verses 1 through 6. Tonight it says, and he went out from thence, or went out from there, and he came into his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath day was come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, From whence hath this man these things? And what wisdom is this which is given unto him, that even such mighty works are wrought by his hands? Is not the carpenter the son of Mary? Now, some speculate that Joseph was no longer in the picture, that Joseph had already died. That's why it's referencing him as the son of Mary. But it says, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph, and of Judah and Simon, and are not his sisters, plural, here with us? And they were offended at him. But Jesus said unto them, A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country, and among his own kin, and in his own house. And he could there do no mighty works, save that he laid his hands upon a few sick folk and healed them. And then it says in verse 6, And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went round about the villages teaching. So last time in chapter 5, Jesus was in Capernaum, and he makes a journey from Capernaum somewhere around 18 to 20 miles to Nazareth, his hometown. And he was going to his hometown for a little rest and relaxation from the ministry. So he comes off the mission field and he goes back to his hometown, back to his family, and not just to his family, but to his family church, the synagogue that he would have been raised up in. And as he's teaching now in the synagogue and speaking, there are those that do not give him a warm welcome. In fact, they're questioning him, who he is and how he's got this kind of authority to be doing these things. And like I said, we're talking about people who can see, we're talking about people who can't see, and then we're talking about people who see too much. Well, this particular group of people just could not see. They could not see him in that role because they had grown up, they had seen him grow up from a boy and now into a man in his 30s. And they could not believe their eyes. Even though that he's doing these works and all these miracles, they're still questioning who he is. Not just his church family, but his earthly family. He had half-brothers, half-sisters. It said plural, so there was more than one sister. And even they, because it says, he even referenced it, not just in his own country, not just in his own town, but in his own house. So even his own siblings could not see him as this. Who is this? Hasn't he always been with us? They see him, but they really can't believe their eyes. And then just look one more time at verse 6. It was such a scene that even he is shocked by it. The fact that, even though he's 100% God, he's still 100% man, and the man part of him is still marveling, it says, which means astonished, perplexed, that even his own earthly kin are not seeing him in this. And so he goes on to move on from this. He brings in verses 7 and 8, it talks about that he brings the disciples together. He gives them instructions. He's sending them out. He's giving them power and authority to not just teach and preach, but to heal. But in verse 11, he teaches them how to handle rejection. He says, "And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear you when you depart thence, shake off the dust under your feet for a testimony against them. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that city." So he gives them specific instructions because he's dealing with this in his own house and in his own town and in his own home church. And that's the rejection. When people just don't see it, they can't, or maybe even if they want to see it, they refuse to see it. And so we know that now there's going to be people with eyes that just can't see it and refuse to believe and refuse to be led by the Spirit. So he tells them, you shake the dust off your feet and you move on. Don't dwell on it. You still have a ministry to do. You still have the kingdom's work to do. And so, at first you go, well, that's kind of tough. Well, not really. You can't dwell on these things, because if you do, it can really leave you bitter and down. But in the ministry and even in God's work, sometimes rejection even happens in our own houses and in our own families. So, he tells us we just got to keep going. But then in verses 14 through 28, the story kind of changes. In verse 12 it says, and they went out and they preached that men should repent, and they cast out many devils. They anointed people with oil. There was healing. It says many were sick and he healed them. They come back and they're doing all these things. And as this is taking place, Herod, King Herod, verse 14 it says, he has heard of him. Now he's heard of Jesus and he's heard all about this, for his name was spread abroad. And he said, now listen what Herod says about Jesus, that he's John the Baptist that has risen from the dead. Well, now, how in the world did John the Baptist die? Because he and Jesus were about the same age and he's young. So now we're going to understand the story of how John the Baptist is killed. It says, and Herod, thinking he was John the Baptist risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show themselves in him. Others said that he is Elijah or one of the Old Testament prophets. But when Herod heard thereof, he said, it is John, who I beheaded. He is risen from the dead. And then it tells the story. Now, we're talking about people who can see, people who can't see, or people who have seen too much. Here we're going to learn about a guy who saw way too much. It says, for Herod himself sent forth and laid hold upon John. Well, what in the world did John do? Because it says Herod bound him up, he threw him into prison for Herodias' sake. Now this was Herod's wife, but it wasn't always Herod's wife. It used to be Herod's kinfolk's wife. It says for Herodias' sake, his brother, and Philip was actually his half-brother, Philip's wife, for he had married her. So Herod takes the wife of his half-brother, steals her away from his half-brother, brings her back to the castle, and brings along her teenage daughter with him. It said, and John has spoken out against it. It was against Jewish law for this to take place. It was even against Roman law for this to take place. And John, being the prophet and the forerunner he is to Jesus, is speaking truth, and he's speaking truth even about this relationship. And Herod's new wife, she doesn't like it. And so Herod, even though he knows he's a just man, he's a holy man, he throws John into prison. And says in verse 18, it is not lawful for thee. That's what John had said. That's the whole reason John got thrown into prison. Therefore Herodias had a quarrel against him. Herod's wife didn't like the fact that John had called out this affair, and she wanted him killed, but she could not. She didn't have that kind of authority. But in verse 20 it says, Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just man, he was holy, he had observed him, he had watched him, and when he had heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. It was moving in Herod's heart when John talked. Herod liked John. He liked him as a man. He liked him as a preacher. But it says, and when a convenient day was come, that it was Herod's birthday, they made a birthday supper for him. All the lords and the high captains and the chiefs of all the estates of Galilee come for Herod's birthday, and his stepdaughter now. And when the daughter of the said Herodias came in and danced, this is his stepdaughter, it pleased Herod. It moved Herod as a man. And them that sat with him, all of them that was in there. And the king said to the damsel, ask of me whatsoever thou wilt, and I will give it to thee. Now this was somebody who saw way too much. It says, and he sware unto her, whatsoever thou shalt ask of me, I will give it to thee unto the half of my kingdom. To this young girl, he's going to give her anything she wants, anything she asks. It says, and she went forth, and she said to her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. And she came in straightway with haste to the king and asked, saying, I will that thou wilt give me by and by in a charger, platter, the head of John the Baptist. And the king was exceedingly sorry. Yeah, you bet he's sorry. But he has an oath to take care of, because if he breaks his word is nothing. So it says, for an oath's sake and for their sake, which sat with him, he would not reject her. And immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, and brought his head in a charger and gave it to the damsel, and the damsel gave it to her mother. So, now think about this for a minute. Herod thought that John the Baptist was so powerful and such a man of God that even when Jesus comes onto the scene, instead of Herod seeing him as sent from God, Herod sees him as the ghost of John the Baptist. That's how much Herod thought of John the Baptist. But what he saw made him totally go against all of his convictions, all of his beliefs of who John the Baptist was. And what he saw was that young woman dancing in front of him. And Jesus talks about this. He talks about what you and I see with our eyes. Turn over to Matthew chapter 6, just a second. We're going to come right back to Mark. But turn over to Matthew chapter 6. And look at verse 22. Well, in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, it says, for where your heart is, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And then in verse 22, Jesus says, the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is the darkness? Now what he's saying here is, if your eyes are pure, you'll be full of light. If what you're seeing is pure, what you're allowing yourself to see is pure, there'll be light, positive light coming in. If what you allow your eyes to see is evil, then there's going to be darkness coming in. Another part, Jesus says, which it really struck some, you'd be better off to poke your eye out than to allow your eyes to send you to hell. That's literally what he said. You'd be better off to gouge your eye out than to allow your eye to be the reason why you end up in hell. And what he's saying is this: you and I really got to watch what we see. We really got to watch the things that are coming in our eyes, because it affects us. And what Herod saw affected him. It totally clouded his judgment. I want to read to you what Job said in Job chapter 31. Job, let's see if I can find it. Job 31 and verse 1. Listen to what Job says. Job says, I made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? In other words, what Job says is, I've made a pact with mine eyes not to lust after a woman. He made a covenant with his own eyes to not lust after a woman. That's how strong Job was. I guess that's one of the reasons why God said Job was one of the most righteous men on the planet. He wouldn't even allow his eyes to go there. He would shield his eyes from it. You know, we sing a song, I don't know what number it is, it turn your eyes upon Jesus, which means it's something that we have to constantly be steering, right? Because our eyes can go all over the place, but the song says, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face. Isn't that how it goes? And the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. All of this is scriptural. We really got to watch what we're seeing. Herod allowed himself to be moved as a man towards his stepdaughter and the dance that she did, and that's how John ended up beheaded. So now John is executed. Well, no, John's murdered. Just plain and simple. John's murdered. He didn't do anything wrong. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. He was calling out what was sin. He was calling out what the Jews believed was wrong. He was calling out what the Romans believed was wrong, that you don't do that. And that's what got him killed. But he was a fearless preacher. He didn't back down from anything. But the amazing thing is, now think about this. John was a fearless preacher. He was the forerunner to Jesus. He called people to repentance before Jesus even started his mission. He didn't back down from anything or anyone, and was probably one of the most powerful preachers of all time. And Jesus didn't even attend his funeral. He did. He didn't have a big service. In fact, it says in Mark chapter 6, it says, and after they had brought his head on a platter and gave it to the damsel, and she gave it to her mother, it says, and when the disciples heard of it, they came and took up his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Doesn't say there was any kind of a big funeral. Doesn't say they hired, they would hire people to actually go out and cry and wail and have a parade. And they didn't do any of that. And didn't say there was much wailing or nothing. It was a private service. It was so private that Jesus wasn't even there when it took place. But because in Matthew 14, verse 12, Matthew gives this same account, and Matthew says that they took him, they put him in the tomb, and they went and told Jesus. Jesus wasn't even there. Now the reason why I'm saying that is because we're talking about people who do not see. We're talking about some people who see too much. And then we're talking about people who do see. John, think about this. John did all these things, and John never got to see Jesus die on the cross. In fact, when John was in prison, John even sent word to Jesus and said, "Are you really the one?" He was having doubts in his heart. He never got to see Jesus stepped out of that tomb. Now think about it. That's pretty strong. And he did all this, and he died, I guess you would say, a martyr, and was buried so privately that still to this day, nobody really knows where the tomb of John the Baptist is. Now there's all kind of speculations. Now I want you to relate that into your life and into your journey, because we may never, just like John, be able to see our spiritual accomplishments. Ever. It's just part of the walk. It's part of the journey. Turn to Hebrews chapter 11 just a minute. Hebrews 11. And verse 1. It says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Let me read that again. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And then it says in verse 2, "For by it," that's talking about faith, "for by faith the elders," that's the people from long ago, "they obtained a good report. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear." There again, it's talking about seeing and not seeing. So it goes on to talk about this whole chapter 11. Is called like the Hall of Fame of faith. It talks about Enoch and Abel, and it talks about Noah and Abraham. I'm just hitting the highlights down here. It talks about who else? Jacob. It talks about Joseph, Moses. It talks about all these people of faith. And then it talks about that there's so many more that have never made this roster of strong faith. It says, verse 33, just fast forward to verse 33. It says, "Who through faith," these are talking about individuals who had faith, "they subdued kingdoms, they wrought righteousness, they obtained promises, they stopped the mouths of lions, they quenched the violence of fire, they escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, they waxed valiant in the fights, they turned to fight the armies of foreign countries. Women had their children raised back to life again. Others, they were tortured, they not accepted the deliverance." In other words, they would not sacrifice their faith to be released, "that they may obtain a better resurrection. And others had trials of cruel mockings, scourgings. Moreover, some were put in prison." Verse 37, it says some were stoned. These are all these people that never made any kind of, their names are not even mentioned in the Bible. These people had faith, and they went through all this. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskin and goat skins and were destitute. Some have starved to death over the years, literally starved to death. It says, "Whom the world was not worthy, they wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves. And these, here it is right here, verse 39. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. They never got to see the fruit of their faith. They did all these things. Some of them starved to death. Some of them were burned at the stake. Some of them, like John, were beheaded, and they never got to see the fruit. Now, just keep reading. It says, verse 40, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Keep going, chapter 12, verse 1. Wherefore, seeing also we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. All these people in the faith now have gone on before us. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth beset us. That's everything from dusting the feet off of our dusting the dust off our feet and moving on, and the sin which doth beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. So, we may never see the fruits of our faith. That's what this is saying. Some saw it. We're talking about people who have seen it, and we're talking about people who haven't seen it. We even talked about Herod, who saw way too much. But you may never see the accomplishments of your faith, or even the accomplishments of your journey on this earth. I think I will always think about when we went to Warrenton. There was a lady in the church, and every time that we asked for prayer, she would ask for prayer for her son, because her son was not saved. Every time. And she died, and about 3 or 4 months after she died, her son started coming to church. About, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 months after she died, her son walked the aisle, gave his heart to Christ, and was baptized. And is still, I talked to the preacher in Warrenton a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him, and he said, yeah, he's still here every Sunday. And I think of his mama. Every time that we'd ask for prayer, she'd mention him. But she never saw it. She never saw that. Now, she'll get to spend eternity with him, but she never saw that happen. I think of James Matthews. Y'all know James Matthews? Does that ring a bell, James Matthews? For some it may, some it may not. We talk about Edmund Botsford a lot. Edmund Botsford gets a lot of credit because his name's on the church. Edmund Botsford was preacher number 1. James Matthews was preacher number 2. He was number 2. He was the one that came in after the Revolutionary War when everything was left in shambles. And from what the record of the Georgia Baptist Convention says, Botsford Meeting House congregation was on the verge of total extinction. And James Matthews came in. He only preached 2 years, but he revived the Botsford congregation. He brought the Botsford congregation back together. Not only that, he planted churches around here. One was Buckhead Church down in what is now Jenkins County. It used to be Burke County. James Matthews did that. He was only here 2 years, but I think about James Matthews. Here we are 252 years later. He has no clue the churches. He went on from here up into Wilkes County and planted churches. He went up into Lincoln County and planted churches. He pastored 40 years. But you know something else? He had a wayward child, a son that he prayed for and prayed for, and was grieved at the end of his life because his son had not made a profession. I wonder about his son. I wonder if that was one of the things he didn't get to see either. I don't know. But the same way that you and I should guard our eyes with the things that we're seeing, on the flip side of that, realize there's a lot of things that you and I won't see. That's where faith steps in. We keep working, not knowing the end result. Joby's fixing to go on a mission trip, leaving Saturday morning at 6 o'clock. He'll never see the fruits of that labor. Probably not. But the thing is, he's going to go anyway with 28 other people, and that's just part of it. So let's go back to Mark chapter 6, and then we'll wrap this up for tonight. I know I've gone a little long. Mark chapter 6. So it says in verse 29, and when his disciples heard of it, they came and took up his corpse, and they laid it in a tomb, and the apostles gathered themselves together with Jesus. Now here's they get together with Jesus. They tell him about John the Baptist, but also it says, and they told him all the things, what they had done and what they had taught. They were actually getting to see the fruits of their labor. They were actually getting to see people coming to the truth. They were actually getting to see healings and miracles. And it says in verse 31, and he said unto them, come ye yourselves apart into a deserted place and rest a while, for there were many coming. They're seeing the fruits. There were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a deserted place by ship privately. And we'll stop there tonight. Before we leave out tonight, is there anybody we need to be praying for? Anybody on your heart?